My name is Patrick Ober, and this is my project on the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I procrastinated a lot on this project. I just wanted you to know. So I'm very sorry if it's lower quality. I apologize about it, but let's get into it. So what was the Arab-Israeli conflict? The Arab-Israeli conflict, it escalated into the 20th century, but it also was into the early 21st century. It was a continuation of social tensions between Arab states and Israel, like political tensions, military conflicts, and other disputes. The Arab-Israeli conflict arose out of the Arab League's support for the Union's Palestinian members. In the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it reemerged in the late 19th century with the rise of Zionism and Arabism at the same time, although the two national movements did not fight until the 1920s. Alright, here's a big timeline of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Alright, 1948, regional conflicts grew amid the end of the British Mandate for Palestine and Israel's declaration of independence in May 1948. A coalition of the Arab states allied with Palestinian factions fought Israel forces. In the end, Israel controlled most of the territory. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were driven from their lands. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, an important trade route linking the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Israel invaded Egypt, followed by troops from Britain and France. The peace accord, backed by the United States and Soviet Union, ended the fighting, but the canal was blocked by sunken ships and did not reopen until 1957. In 1967, the Six-Day War began with Israeli warplanes attacking Egyptian airfields and Israeli ground forces entering the Sinai Peninsula. The war broke out amid a protracted conflict, including an Egyptian shipping block that continued to the Gulf of Aqaba, or however you say that. Jordan joined the battle alongside Egypt, but Israel forces had the upper hand after nearly wiping out Egyptian air power. Israel controls the Gaza Strip, Sinai, West Bank, Golan Heights, and Arab-dominated East Jerusalem. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled, I guess. 1973, a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. Arab forces initially managed to gain control of the territory but were repelled by an Israeli counter-offensive aided by supplies from allies including the United States. 1978, the peace accord between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, known as the Camp David Accord, was brokered on September 17th, 1978, by President Jimmy Carter. A potential Palestinian peace proposal was discussed but never carried out. 1987, a Palestinian uprising, or Intifada, brings clashes and protests in the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. The unrest continued for years, with many killed or injured on both sides. 1993, the first of two pacts known as the Oslo Accords is signed between Israel and Palestine Liberation Organization, establishing a peace process based on previous UN resolutions. A follow-up agreement was signed in 1995. The agreement created the Palestinian Authority to oversee most administrative affairs in the West Bank and Gaza. The PLO is recognized by Israel and the United States as a negotiating partner. Unresolved, however, are key issues such as Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the status of Jerusalem, which Palestinians view as the capital of any future state. 2000, the second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising, begins after unrest broke out following the visit of the right-wing Israeli political figure Ariel Sharon and later Prime Minister to a compound in Jerusalem revered in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Clashes and other violence continued to 2005, leaving hundreds of people dead on both sides. 2006, the Palestinian militant group Hamas wins elections in Gaza, leading to political tensions with the more moderate Fatah party controlling the West Bank. 2008, Israel begins a 3-week offensive on Gaza following rocket attacks on Israel by Palestinian militants supplied through the tunnels of Egypt. More than 1,110 Palestinians and at least 13 Israelis were killed. 2012, Israel kills Hamas military chief Ahmed Jabari, sparking more than a week of rocket fire from Gaza and Israeli airstrikes. At least 150 Palestinians and 6 Israelis were killed. 2014, Hamas militants kill 3 kidnapped Israeli teenagers near a Jewish settlement in the West Bank, prompting an Israeli military response. Hamas responded with rocket fire from Gaza. The 7-week conflict left more than 2,200 Palestinians dead in Gaza. In Israel, 67 soldiers and 6 civilians were killed. 2017, the Trump administration recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital and announces that it plans to move from the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv, sparking outrage among Palestinians. 2018, protests took place in Gaza along the fence with Israel, including demonstrators throwing stones and patrol bombs across the barrier. Israeli forces killed more than 170 protesters over several months. In November, Israel carried out a covert attack on Gaza. At least 7 suspected Palestinian militants and a senior and Israeli military officer were killed. From Gaza, hundreds of rockets were fired at Israel. 2021. After weeks of tension in Jerusalem causing Israeli police to storm the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Islam's holiest sites, Hamas fires rockets at the city for the first time in years, prompting Israel to retaliate with airstrikes. The fighting, the fiercest since at least 2014, saw thousands of rockets fired from Gaza and hundreds of airstrikes on Palestinian territories, with more than 200 killed in Gaza and at least 10 killed in Israel. Here are just some pictures from the Arab-Israeli war. These count as consequences and repercussions of the war. There's destroyed buildings, there's people making their own guns, destroyed cars, injured people, protests. So what solutions could there have been? Although there could have been plenty of solutions, my personal favorite one that would have helped the most would be the two-state solution. This plan creates 2 states for 2 peoples, Israel and Palestine. Hypothetically, the Israel state would retain a Jewish majority, thus remaining a Jewish state, and the Palestinian state would have a Muslim Arab majority. It would resolve conflict while still remaining so simple. It's just Jewish people on one side and Muslim people on the other side with no reason to fight. However, there is another solution called the one-state solution, also called the binational state. This would create one democratic, secular state in which both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs would live as citizens with equal rights. So it's kind of like those "This Is Our Getting Along" shirts, except with an entire state and 2 different religions. However, I feel the two-state plan would be more beneficial as the people would be more to themselves and their own kind with no fear of anything like being started up, like any fights or anything. So this was my world history project, my final for 2022. I hope you liked it. Thank you for your time.